Did you know that the Chrono series is actually a trilogy? Well, kind of. It's complicated. Between the widely praised classic Chrono Trigger and its divisive sequel Chrono Cross lies a mysterious third title, only ever released in Japan through an online service for the Super Nintendo. This mysterious game follows our protagonist Surge, the spunky master thief Kid, and a mysterious magician named Majil as they sneak their way into Viper Manor to steal a relic known as the Frozen Flame from the evil mastermind Lynx. Wait a minute, isn't this just a story to Chrono Cross? Well, part of Chrono Cross anyway. As I've said once, and I'm sure I'll say again, it's complicated. But according to Chrono Cross, the story of this game is indeed canon, at least in some universe. And given how squirrely things get once we decide to take parallel universes and multiple timelines into account, I see no reason not to count it. So, let's talk about the pseudo-sequel to Chrono Trigger and the rough draft for Chrono Cross, Radical Dreamers. I try to be as thorough and accurate as possible when doing the history sections of these videos, but information on Radical Dreamers is incredibly thin and there are a lot of gaps in the story. I'm gonna try and make it as clear as possible when I'm making assumptions or when info is just completely missing during the rest of this section. What we know for sure is that Chrono Trigger was an immediate success in Japan, selling more than 2 million units after only 2 months on the market. To capitalize on the game's popularity, Square released 3 companion pieces of the game through the newly launched Satellaview, which was a Super Famicom peripheral that allowed players to play games that had been downloaded via satellite. Now, I was going to go more in depth on this console add-on, but I see no point in doing so when I can just guide you to another YouTuber who has already done a fantastic job covering it. For a more in-depth look at the Satellaview, I suggest you watch the video 16-Bit Gems number 20, BS Zelda and Satellaview Retrospective by Rue from Clan of the Grey Wolf. He goes into great detail on the service, and you'll also get to learn about a couple of Zelda games that you likely didn't know existed. In fact, just watch his entire 16-Bit Gems series, it's fantastic. I really wish he was still making content. On the incredibly unlikely chance he ever stumbles upon this video, I just want to say, Rue, thanks for the inspiration. For those curious, the 3 companion pieces released to this system were Chrono Trigger Jet Bike Special, which is nearly identical to the race minigame in Chrono Trigger, a character library, which contained information on the characters and monsters from said game, and a music library, which let you listen to the songs at your leisure. The latter 2 add-ons may sound familiar to Chrono Trigger players, as they've been packaged with every release of the game since. Now, I have to assume, see, there it is, that these downloadable bonuses were at least somewhat successful, because somewhere along the line, Square decided to let Masato Kato, one of the lead writers of Chrono Trigger, work on another project for the Satellaview. But this is where things get really muddy. Given the limited information on hand, I'm not sure if he was specifically tasked with making a game in the Chrono universe, or if he was just given the option to make a game for the Satellaview service in general. Regardless of how the project originated, Mr. Kato used the opportunity to create a game that would, quote, resolve unfinished business left behind from Chrono Trigger. Because the product was not going to be released to the public through traditional means and profit game wasn't a priority, Kato was given an unprecedented amount of freedom to make the title any way he wanted. He has stated that this, along with his bitterness at the hectic production of Chrono Trigger, led to Radical Dreamers' darker tone. Of course, this freedom didn't come without any drawbacks. Radical Dreamers was given a scant 3-month development period, during which Kato worked almost solely on the main story arc, while he let other writers work on the optional arcs, which would only be viewable on repeat playthroughs. Only 11 months after the release of Chrono Trigger, Radical Dreamers was made available to the public, but not in the way you might expect. In addition to being released solely through a subscription-based download service, it also did nothing to promote itself as a sequel to Chrono Trigger. Players would have to happen upon this information themselves by blindly downloading the game, only to be fed small hints here and there, slowly revealing the truth as they played. My biggest regret while making this video is that I'm unable to find any information regarding how the game was received by Japanese players at the time of release. I am incredibly curious how this bit of Kojima-esque secrecy was received, long before Kojima was even known for it. Time went on and the Satellaview servers were eventually shut down. Because there was never a physically released version of Radical Dreamers, it would likely never be played again. Even attempts made by Square to re-release the title officially as a bonus on the PlayStation version of Chrono Trigger were vetoed by Kato himself, who stated that he wasn't happy with the work he'd done on the game, which is something we'll explore a bit later in this video. But in an amazing bout of luck, at least one copy of Radical Dreamers existed in the wild, still installed in a Satellaview cartridge long after the service was shut down. This was an anomaly because most games in the Satellaview would only allow you to play the downloaded games a certain number of times before the system would lock you out. Radical Dreamers was built with no such counter. Eventually, the ROM was found and dumped to the internet, allowing players to experience the game through emulation. And of course, as emulation grew, so did the popularity of fan translations. Thanks to the work of the talented translation group Demiforce, English-speaking fans were given the chance to finally play Radical Dreamers in 2003. And here I am, playing it via emulation 16 years later. So, let's dive into the actual review. Being a visual novel, the most important aspect of the game is obviously the writing, and without getting too specific so I can avoid spoilers for the time being, I'll just say that as a standalone story in terms of plotting and drama, I don't find Radical Dreamers all that compelling. The execution, on the other hand, is phenomenal. The in-the-moment writing always rings out with a level of professionalism and quality that I was entranced by, which is saying a lot considering many modern-day visual novels that are being sold for real money have translations that feel as if they haven't even been proofread. Whether Radical Dreamers' writing quality is based on the original text or is thanks to the translation efforts of Team Demiforce, I can't possibly know. But I can say that I was constantly impressed by the strength of the prose. The text was effectively descriptive, tonally astute, and most importantly, concise. I see this as a particularly important point since I've lost interest in almost every other visual novel I've attempted to read because of a complete lack of consideration to pacing. Even supposed greats failed to keep me entertained. Clannad, Higurashi, Kira, they have a bad habit of showing characters' day-to-day life to the point of drudgery, and I thankfully never felt that way while playing through Radical Dreamers. This is mostly because it's telling the tale of one specific event, the attempted theft of the Frozen Flame, as opposed to following characters for an extended period. The game is always moving forward at what I deem to be a perfect pace given the story's content, with only one real exception that I'll get into soon enough. It is just slow enough to let you truly soak in the atmosphere of Viper Manor without being a slog. It definitely helps that the game's runtime is only about 3 hours for the main arc, with an additional 4 to 5 for all the joke arcs, though my attention was definitely waning through most of those. Now I must admit that this does make me question the validity of my own perspective a bit, given that I may just not be a fan of the genre. With the exception of hybrid games like 999 and Phoenix Wright, maybe visual novels just aren't for me. So far, the only one that's held my attention has been Katawa Shoujo. If you're a fan of visual novels, maybe you should drop some recommendations in the comments. Let me know if my experience with the genre holds up or if I've just had terrible luck in picking out visual novels. I find that they're a great way to relax if I read them an hour before bed. And so far I've been half right. They have done a good job of putting me to sleep. The real reason I pointed out this bias is so that you all have some perspective moving forward when I give my critique. That way you'll have a better understanding of where I'm coming from. In terms of presentation, the game is pixel perfect. It's full of artfully rendered tableaus that I can't believe were possible on the Super Nintendo. The game mostly uses still shots, but what little animation there is, such as the stairway transitions and the booby traps, offer just enough in the way of variety to keep my visual appetite properly sated. Unsurprisingly, the music is fantastic. Composer Yasunori Mitsuda returned to work on Radical Dreamers, and many of the compositions were later recycled for use in Chrono Cross. So fans of the latter soundtrack actually have a lot to thank Radical Dreamers for. Yeah, John, I'm calling you out. Everybody go check out Cross Symphonic, it's really good music. What's more surprising is that a significant portion of the game doesn't even have background music, instead relying purely on ambient sounds. Atmospheric has become a bit of a dirty word in game criticism because of its overuse and overall vagueness, but damn it all if Radical Dreamers isn't atmospheric. The writing, visuals, and sound all blend seamlessly to create a foreboding setting that I genuinely wanted to explore. Set exploration is handled the same way everything else in the game is handled, through an intuitive text interface, but there's no map feature and you go into the manor blind, making the game's most important interactive element the traversal and eventual memorization of the building's layout. This is, of course, sprinkled with bouts of character banter, exposition, and puzzle solving whenever you reach a new room. Unfortunately, this exploration is far too often interrupted because Radical Dreamers has random encounters. In these battles, you're given only a short amount of time to decide on Surge's actions or he will falter, losing his turn and likely taking damage. At first, this too serves as a puzzle, at least in a way, a sort of trial and error memory test that the player can eventually overcome because most of these battles have patterns that you can actually learn. While this method of executing combat is creative in concept and visceral through its prose, it becomes tedious immediately and makes the game and story less immersive as a result. Once you know which options are correct to come out of a fight unscathed, the battles become invariable to the point you will often see the same actions repeated multiple times in the same combat scenario. As I've already stated, the prose is beautiful, but I don't want to have to reread the same paragraph multiple times in one fight. The first time I successfully defeated a goblin without taking damage, I was ecstatic. By the third, I was bored, but by the 10th, I was annoyed. Of course, this only applies to the battles that actually have a learnable pattern. While those become tedious, the battles with random solutions are far worse. There's a scripted battle about halfway through the arc that appears on the surface to be the same as the one I just showed you a clip from, a fight against goblins, and yet the success and failure of the options you choose in this specific fight are completely random. Not relearnable, not uniquely written because this is essentially a boss scenario, but completely random. I got my one and only game over here because I wasn't aware of this mechanic. This happens with the griffin fights as well, but in reverse. If you run into them as a random encounter, your success and failure will be determined completely by luck. But when this creature returns as a scripted encounter later in the game, there actually is a correct solution. While perhaps a bit crude to say, I consider this an absolute failure of game design. A player can't be expected to perform well in a game when the core rules are being flipped on and off at the designer's whim. They could have made all the choices based on luck or all the patterns learnable, but they should not have done both with encounters that appear to be identical. So, in case it wasn't obvious, I feel Radical Dreamers is far more interesting when combat isn't a factor. The random encounters get in the way of the intended atmosphere, and they undoubtedly interrupt the game's pacing. This was remedied about halfway through my playthrough when suddenly random encounters just stopped happening. I wasn't even going to mention this, but I feel I have to because I'm not sure if it was a glitch or an intentional design decision, or if RNGesus was just blessing me with luck. Either way, I was incredibly thankful. Not just because it stopped the constant interruptions to my immersion, but because Surge was close to death and I needed the reprieve. What players may not notice right away is the game is keeping track of two bits of information in the background based upon the choices the player makes: Surge's health and Kid's affection for Surge. The former's use is obvious enough. If Surge loses all of his health, it'll result in the game over, while Kid's affection, as far as I can tell, only slightly modifies the ending, at least in the main arc, which makes the first hidden stat the only vital one. I almost always prefer games that have some sort of fail state because they make me feel like I have agency as a player. With this in mind, I want to make it very clear that I am not against death as a penalty, but the way random battles are implemented means that a player could potentially lose all of their progress due to no fault of their own, and that is something I see a problem with. And it's not as if removing combat, outside of the few scripted encounters that is, which I do feel work to spice things up, would hurt the game in any significant way. There are a number of traps in the game that the player can fall into, or minor mistakes the player can make that still end up doing damage to Surge. So the game over fail state could still be possible with a simple rebalancing of damage variables. Though, admittedly, most of the non-combat scenarios make it fairly easy to avoid damage if you just use common sense. Perhaps that's why they felt the need to add in the possible random damage in the first place. Look, I can see the reasoning, but I certainly don't agree with it. And now we're moving on to the story, and this is where spoilers become unavoidable. And not just spoilers for Radical Dreamers, but spoilers for the end of Chrono Trigger, and by extension Chrono Cross. Kinda, but not really. Like I keep saying, it's complicated. I already gave the game's basic premise in the video intro. You control a band of thieves who break into a manor to steal the frozen flame. Aside from that, there isn't a lot to it. You are slowly drip-fed some minor character details about your party, and of course you meet Lynx and learn of Kid's reason for going after the flame in the first place, but it's all pretty straightforward and not worth going into serious detail on. When it comes down to it, the only aspect of the story I found truly intriguing were all the similarities and differences I could spot between Radical Dreamers and Chrono Cross. For example, all, the Frozen Flame had a significant redesign, as did Surge, who was originally a bard in Radical Dreamers. This was the original design for Radius. Riddell is also here, but in Radical Dreamers, she's the adopted daughter of Lynx. Speaking of Lynx, this was his original design. This is fantastically awful. I love it. But outside of Lynx, I actually feel that most of the shared elements between Radical Dreamers and Chrono Cross are considerably better in Radical Dreamers. The main cast is a huge example of this. I'm sure by now you're all aware of my distaste for silent protagonists, so Surge being a fully fledged, self-thinking character in Radical Dreamers is automatically a point in the game's favor from my perspective. And in Radical Dreamers, Kid is actually a character instead of just a plot device. And perhaps it was because I was seeing her through the infatuated eyes of this rendition of Surge, but I grew to enjoy and actually care about the well-being of Kid throughout this game's short runtime, which is not a sentiment I share with the Kid from Chrono Cross. Viper Manor feels like a character in its own right thanks to the beautiful prose, gothic atmosphere, and frequent surprises. From talking statues to a fountain full of piranhas, you never know what you're going to find. Compare this to Chrono Cross's rendition, where you run in straight lines through vibrantly colored, non-threatening hallways, and the difference is striking. It was actually a bit nerve-wracking to watch Surge's physical state slowly weaken while I attempted to sneak through my adversary's den. But in Chrono Cross, I was strolling through a house of fools, completely uninhibited and unthreatened. While the multiple routes into Viper Manor are all creative and fun to play through, I think Viper Manor itself may be one of the least interesting areas in all of Chrono Cross. And now that I know its inspiration and see what it could have been, I'm doubly disappointed by that fact. But as much fun as I had comparing and contrasting the two titles, it's an ultimately pointless exercise when trying to suss out the quality of Radical Dreamers, because Chrono Cross didn't exist yet at the time of the game's release. What did exist was Chrono Trigger, and despite all the connections I've listed in regards to Chrono Cross, there are significantly fewer tying this game to its predecessor. In the history section of this video, I discussed that Kato's reason for wanting to make Radical Dreamers in the first place was to resolve unfinished business from Chrono Trigger, and based upon the final product, I honestly and truly have no idea what this unfinished business was supposed to be. Apparently the fate of Shala left many players scratching their head after beating Chrono Trigger, but that never made sense to me. She sacrificed herself so Chrono's friends could escape the Ocean Palace with their lives. The only thing potentially hinting otherwise is how Magus says he plans to search for her in 12,000 BC at the end of the game, but I never interpreted that as a leading cliffhanger. I'd always assumed that the incredibly loose time travel mechanics of Chrono Trigger meant that it was possible to find her, perhaps before the Man-Machine incident, and that Magus and Shala would ultimately be reunited. That, or it was just another attempt to show how obsessed Magus is, making him an even more tragic character since it was unlikely he ever would find her. In my opinion, this wasn't a plot thread that needed resolving. There was enough in the original text for it to be satisfying, especially since that wasn't the purpose of the story. Using time travel to destroy Lavos was. Of course, over time, Square has made this a bit more confusing. The DS remake of Chrono Trigger in specific builds up this mystery to something I believe it was never intended to be, showing Magus' fate as he loses his memory and wanders the world aimlessly after failing to save Shala from the Time Devourer. But this element of the story wasn't introduced until 2008, almost a decade after Chrono Cross's original release, and frankly, it creates more questions than it answers, making the whole scenario feel like a misfire. After all, Magus isn't even in Chrono Cross. Though there were teases at Guile being Magus, it has been repeatedly confirmed that this is not the case. And thank God, because that would have been a massive butchering of Magus' character. Once again, I'm getting ahead of myself. The point is, if the goal of Radical Dreamers was to tie up the supposedly loose end regarding the fate of Shala and Magus, then it technically does so, but in such a distant, tenuous way that it feels almost pointless. In Radical Dreamers, it's essentially revealed that Kid is in fact Shala, and that Majil is Magus. In this way, it was supposed to be a continuation of Chrono Trigger, but aside from a few hints at Majil knowing the owner of the Masamune, and the blatant reveal of Kid being Shala during the game's climax, this revelation goes completely unexamined. If someone had told me this was written to be a standalone story, and the references to Chrono Trigger were painted over the initial design, a la Star Fox Adventures Over Dinosaur Planet, I would have believed it. And after doing some research, I found that this wasn't far from the truth. The short production schedule forced Kato to essentially make up the story as he coded it. If the sources I found are accurate, then he hadn't even truly decided upon the fact that Majil is actually Magus and that Shala is actually Kid until the latter end of the project. This makes me even more doubtful that the Shala Magus mystery really was something that the writers felt needed a conclusion to in the first place, given that it was an afterthought during the design process of Radical Dreamers. But at this point, it's all just my speculation. Regardless, Chrono Trigger's story, despite the many problems I had with it, was pretty well self-contained, and the only supposed plot point that wasn't resolved still doesn't get a satisfying resolution here. Radical Dreamers also fails to add any information that could have changed the way players viewed the story of Chrono Trigger in retrospect, which is something I feel is actually rectified in Chrono Cross. For the most part. With all that in mind, I can completely understand why Mr. Kato was disappointed in Radical Dreamers as a final product, even though it makes for a fascinating piece of art in its own right. All of my critique so far has been in reference to Radical Dreamers' canon story arc, but in Chrono series tradition, the title has several alternate endings that can be unlocked if you replay the game, though like Chrono Trigger, almost all of these endings are played for comedy. If you ever wanted to see an RPG party fight off a perverted sunflower, then this is the game for you. And that's barely scratching the surface of how wacky some of these arcs become. Apparently Kato gave free rein to other writers for these multiple endings, and Medi went all out with the opportunity. But because they're all jokes, I have no real desire to focus on them further. They are there for those that enjoy that sort of thing, and I have no doubt that they will be entertaining to many, but they aren't really to my taste. To me, there's no getting around the fact that Radical Dreamers is more interesting as a piece of gaming history and as a technical achievement than it is a game in its own right. And because of that, the review section of this video was a bit thin. As someone who's been forced to become intimately familiar with the Chrono franchise over the past couple of years, getting a glimpse into these early ideas for what would become Chrono Cross was fascinating. I've always loved behind-the-scenes peeks at films and games. I like knowing how art comes to be, and Radical Dreamers is an incredibly rare example of those early ideas actually coming to fruition as a ready-for-market product. But that's where most of my enjoyment ended. Without the context of Chrono Cross and seeing all the similarities and differences between Radical Dreamers and that title, there's just not a lot here. It left me with this strange, counterintuitive feeling. It's incredibly well written, it has gorgeous pixel art, I was certainly entertained while reading through it, but my life would have been just as complete if I'd never bothered. Radical Dreamers is a highly unique video game experience that shows why game preservation is so important, but its most alluring element is that it could have easily become a relic lost to time. Thanks to the hard work of game preservationists and fan translators, it's possible for anyone with a working computer and the ability to read Japanese, English, or French, thanks to another group of fan translators, to experience it. As for me, I'm happy I played it, so I can say I played it, but I'm fairly certain I'll never touch it again. So, uploads have still been somewhat slow, but there are good reasons for that. I've spent the last few weeks working on some large upcoming projects, as well as finally getting back around to some older ones, but there are two important things that have been accomplished since my last upload. For one, I've been upgrading a bunch of my equipment, modding consoles and the like so I can get higher quality footage and have access to out-of-region games and fan translations. I'm now capable of getting HDMI output from my PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3, PlayStation Portable, PlayStation Vita, my Nintendo GameCube, and my Wii.
Dr. Stiles.
Okay, that's too perfect for me not to cover at some point. Over the next few months, I plan on making upgrades to my original Xbox and Sega Dreamcast as well. But most exciting of all is I'm now capable of recording 3DS footage. Kinda. I soft-modded the system and could technically stream the video over Wi-Fi to my PC to record the footage, but it staggers terribly. I've come nowhere near close to making the frame rate smooth enough to be of acceptable quality. But I can now take screenshots on my 3DS, meaning that I can still cover those games with a sort of slideshow format, which is better than nothing. Given that the main manufacturer of 3DS capture cards shut down and I don't have $600 to throw around, this may be the best I can do until 3DS emulation becomes much better. But point is, I spent a couple weeks making it possible for me to cover a significantly larger breadth of games, what I consider to be an acceptable level of fidelity given my budget, which is approximately $3.62. Speaking of budget, we're on to accomplishment number 2. Stiles Reviews finally has a Patreon page. I know, maybe a little early for me to sell out, but hey, Gotta keep this dream alive somehow. I've actually had some fans asking for this for a while. It's no secret that like everyone else on this platform, I'd like to one day make this my actual job. And while that is an incredibly unlikely scenario, I can at least use donations to put towards the show in the form of equipment upgrades, game purchases, and the like. There will be rewards involved. I have some written content, well so far one piece of written content on the site that's exclusive to those donating over a certain threshold, and I'll be sure to add to that as time goes on. I explained in great detail what the money will be going towards and what my goals are for the channel moving forward, so even if you don't want to donate, it'll give you some insight into my process if you check out the page. Speaking of, while in the middle of working on this video, Stiles Reviews got its first patron, so thank you very much to Super Pelican Gaming for being the first financial backer. Guess I've got to start taking this YouTube thing a bit more seriously now that I'm technically getting paid. Does this make me a professional critic finally? But by definition, right? That's all for this episode. Thank you all for watching, and please don't forget to like this video and share it around, maybe back my Patreon. Also, please feel free to leave comments on what you thought of this video, what you think of the Chrono series, so on and so forth. I'll see you guys next time.